Welcome to the Navik Gaming Podcast, where it is our mission to explore the business and future of video games. We bring together the industry's brightest builders, investors, and thinkers to keep a pulse on current events, dissect emerging trends in games, share lessons learned, and have a great time. This podcast is also part of Navik's growing ecosystem, which ranges from free and premium research to consulting and advisory services. For more information, visit www.navik.co. This episode is brought to you by Neon. For the first time in our industry, developers can finally have their own D2C channels to save on App Store fees and build closer relationships with players. But there's a catch. Selling direct means either building complex infrastructure yourself or choosing among legacy providers whose inexperience in games or questionable reputations pose real risk to your business. Luckily, there's Neon, the D2C platform built for games. As a merchant of record with customizable web shops optimized for conversion and modern APIs that let you use your existing LiveOps tools, Neon is trusted by some of the biggest names in gaming to help you sell direct without the typical overhead. To start selling direct and finally take control over your full player experience, simply head to neonpay.com or check out the link in the show notes. And with that, let's jump into the episode.
Welcome to the Navik Gaming Podcast. I'm your host, David Taylor. The Call of Duty franchise needs no introduction, but today we're speaking with a leader who has been there since it launched in 2003. So let's do a quick review. Call of Duty is the best-selling first-person shooter franchise and the second best-selling video game franchise of all time, after Mario and ahead of Pokemon and Tetris. It reportedly surpassed over 500 million copies sold in 2023, over 30 billion in revenue, and maintains a monthly active user base of 100 million players, according to the Washington Post. Over the years, there's been three primary studios working on it. Infinity Ward created the franchise in the seminal Modern Warfare series. Treyarch established zombie modes in World at War and the popular Black Ops series, and Sledgehammer Games joined later to co-develop titles starting in the 2010s. Today, we're going to dive into Call of Duty's amazing history through the lens of Treyarch. With that, I'm thrilled to be joined by the former studio head of Treyarch, Dan Bunting, who is now the founder of Ready Up Games and a venture partner at 1AM Gaming. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So we're going to cover a lot of your career over the next hour, but just to kick us off, could you give an introduction on your journey? How did you get into the video game industry, and how did you find yourself at Treyarch back in 2003 when the C.O.D franchise was just getting started?
Well, how I got into games was a very meandering path, but eventually got there. As a young kid, of course, I played games like everybody in the 80s. Kid Icarus was the first NES game that kind of like got me addicted to really hard games, which I love hard games to this day. Zelda, Mario, I played them all on my 13-inch black and white TV in my bedroom when I was a kid. Growing up playing games, I never quite, I didn't think of it as a career or a thing that you could do. I kind of grew up with a very traditional sort of upbringing with, go to school, study hard, get good grades, overperform, and then, find a good paying job. Like I never thought of games, When I got to college, that was when kind of in the mid 90s when the id Software explosion happened. And I got very hooked on first person shooters, Quake 1, Quake 2. I was really into the mod community, mod scene. And I was, I would download and play every mod that came out from the modders. The original Team Fortress mod became sort of my go-to game for like 2 years after that. And so, from that point forward, I was hooked on games. I mean, for my whole life, but shooters specifically from kind of college on. When I graduated in the late 90s, I had kind of done a tour around Europe, backpacking and such, trying to find myself and figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And I knew that I wanted to do something creative in what I would think of as sort of like at that point in time, a Renaissance art, like something that's multidisciplinary, that involves art, storytelling, engineering, history, everything that you can imagine in terms of the arts coming together to tell stories. And so I decided I was either going to go to grad school for architecture, I was going to get into film and TV, or I was going to get into video games. Those are my three paths. I didn't set one in stone, but just kind of packed everything I owned up into a car, drove out to LA because LA was a place that you could do all three of those things, and started my journey there. First job I took was at FX Networks doing kind of part-time work for a while, and then got full-time there. That became, 4 years of kind of learning how to be a professional, I guess, which was fun, but it wasn't my career ambition. And, ultimately I realized to get serious about what I wanted to do with my life, I wanted to get into games. So I just started pounding the pavement. It took me about 7 months from start to finish. Every day I would keep a journal of whatever network connection I would make. I would talk to anybody and everybody, and I didn't care, how executive level or high up they were. I just was, I would cold call people. I would try to get warm introductions, whatever I could do. And the funny thing is that of all of the connections I made over that 7 months, it was actually the very first call that I made that led to the job 7 months later at Treyarch. And so, the rest is kind of history. That was how I got in. I mean, it was a lot of interviews. At that point in time, they were really focused on Spider-Man games. And I originally had interviewed with the Spider-Man producer. But then he referred me to this other project that was a new project, which is called Dead Rush. And Dead Rush was an open world zombie survival horror game, which had a lot of potential. It was a lot of fun. There was really great gameplay mechanics and features in it. But ultimately, I think the company determined it was too big of a risk, and they shut down the game in 2004, which was, a blessing for me because I was fortunate to be then put on the Call of Duty team in early 2004. So, and that was right after the first game launched. So that was the beginning. That kind of, I guess, walks you through my journey.
That's amazing. And I feel like that zombie game is going to somehow come back later in the story.
Yeah.
And I also love that, you mentioned that you're like passionate about history and, then you found yourself at Call of Duty. Like, it just sounds like this was meant to be.
Yeah,
like,
definitely. It was a dream come true for sure.
Yeah. That's awesome. Okay. So you're at Treyarch in 2004. Could you take us through your journey at Treyarch as well? And then we'll sort of dive into like a bunch of questions about those different time periods, but would love to just understand your journey going through Treyarch.
Yeah, well, so I joined in 2003. The very first project that I mentioned, Dead Rush, was a super small team. I think we had like 15 developers, and it was, it was like scrappy startup land. I mean, it was a risky kind of new IP. You didn't have the same kind of, publishing backing that you would have for a large, proven franchise or anything. So in a lot of ways, it was like an indie game that a startup would do. It was small team, very scrappy. We had to kind of, figure out how to do more than other teams with less, but it was a great experience for me to just cut my teeth. One of my first jobs was just to go around to every team member every day and kind of like figure out what was going on, what tasks they were working on, what was their schedule like, which was super intimidating because I didn't know anybody and I was new to the games industry. So I had to go, be this like nerdy little kid who's I think in their minds probably just annoying. But it was really, an amazing first experience because it forced me, number one, to get out of my shell and talk to people. Number two, it taught me what everybody on the team did and understanding workflows and tasks and how games are put together. So I think that, the kind of the year one of training wheels was actually a really good way for me to start my career because it gave me a good cross section of what everybody does and how games are made. So that was I'm thankful for that experience. And I think that the fact that the game got canceled was a blessing in disguise, obviously, for me.
Were there any things that sort of set you up to be successful in that role from your past that you can sort of touch on? Like, being able to ask people questions, or
Mm-hmm.
the fact that you had spent a lot of time on mods and sort of getting an understanding for how games got made just as a player?
I would say that, well, there's a number of things. One, I kind of, one of my, I guess, if everyone has their own superpowers. One of my superpowers is I tend to spin a lot of plates. And I think part of that's just kind of my background of, I was a very bookish kid, very, heavy on schoolwork, and was able, like, always try to push ahead on things beyond my, comfort zone. I waited tables in college. That was another one that forced me to, like,
Nice.
multitask and just, like, deal with stuff, deal with stress. And then in the TV role that I had, it was a production role, so it was a lot of coordination across a lot of different people, a lot of departments, internal and external. I was talking to big producers of TV shows, and I was taught up to vendors who would drive tapes from one place to another. So it was just, I think, like, all of that kind of multitasking, prioritization, mission driven kind of emphasis is what really helped me establish that strong foundation.
That's awesome. Okay, so we got a lot of ground to cover between you as sort of the person going around and just checking in on what everybody's working on,
Mm-hmm.
to co-studio head. So what was sort of like your progression from there? Like, what were the opportunities that came up? And I know that the franchise just kept growing, but how did you move through the ranks and become the studio head?
Um, you know, wow, that's a long one. It is a very, any career path is going to be a very long and kind of meandering journey. I think that on the first project, the executive producer of that project had taken a particular interest in me because I was such a hustler and, like, just trying to get everything done to the best quality as much as I possibly could, and just like overloading myself with work. And I think that really helped me. That was probably the main reason why I was put on the Call of Duty team in the first place, because it was, it wasn't like everybody just got moved over. They did handpick a select number of people. And I think that, from there, it was just like I would do anything. I would order food. I would, I think on that first project, I got my first two employees, quote unquote, which were like the only QA testers, internal QA testers on the project. One of whom I brought onto the team and is now, an art director on the weapons and vehicles team, which is amazing. And I love him, and that was part of, like, that was also part of my career journey. Was I would always bring people up when I identified talent, bring people into the development team, and give them a safe place to grow and learn and kind of shape the culture alongside the rest of the team. So that next project was Call of Duty United Offensive, which was branded as an expansion pack after the first Call of Duty launched, but it was really a full game. We had joined with the team at Gray Matter, which was a smaller PC dev shop. They had also just had a project canceled. And so we brought together the PC first-person shooter, like hardcore gamer chops of Gray Matter into the console, mass market expertise of Treyarch at the time. I was much more of a Gray Matter type of person because of coming out of the Quake community and mods and being super hardcore into first person shooters. So I like when I moved over to the Gray Matter building, that was really the beginning for me, because I just kind of gelled with that team there, and a lot of those team members are still currently the director level of Treyarch today. So it did eventually, Call of Duty took over, as it has done within the larger Activision family.
Amazing. So sounds like you just it was I think you were there for 18 years, and just
Yeah.
over the years, more opportunity, more success, and you just sort of kept getting more responsibility.
Yeah, and a part of it is just the under promise over deliver, always trying to just do the best that you possibly can. I tend to be a very mission focused person, so it's like whatever that thing is, whatever the right thing to do for that project is and that team is where my my North Star is going to be. And so I'm just always pushing to make things better. And it's, personal life goal to always leave things better than I found them. So that kind of motivation, I think, drove me and propelled my career. Those first three projects we worked on, each one was done in under a year. So 2004, 2005, 2006, we shipped games. And it was a brutal slog. I mean, anybody who makes games, especially at that scale, can understand how, especially a multi-platform, global, fully localized, simultaneous launch, how challenging that can be. And then, by the time we got to World at War, that was a big turning point for us as a team at Treyarch, because we were no longer sort of just cranking out these second games that are behind or underneath one of the Infinity Ward games, but we were now making a proper standalone 2-year development where we actually for the first time got to utilize the same tools that the Infinity Ward team had been using, the same tech. And so I think World at War really was where the expression of Treyarch first came out. It was like, that was our identity. That was that was kind of who we were. And it was dark, it was edgy. It pushed boundaries. It made people uncomfortable.
It was like the first game that had dismemberment, I think.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And, and player some player narrative choices in the mix, which became a theme as time went by. And, we also, as a team at Treyarch, also part of our identity was that we felt like we were underdogs. We felt like we had something to prove. We kind of had a chip on our shoulder. So we sort of overextended ourselves on our ambitions. World at War, we got 2 years to make that game. We're like, hey, let's go make a co-op campaign. Not smart, but that was kind of where our head was at. And so we built that game, for co-op. And that required us to basically take the engine apart and put all the parts, on the on the garage floor, and then put them back together with networking, which was no small feat. And it also took a long time. So our first 2-year development was actually ended up being basically another 1-year development, because so much of the work that went on without having a co-op campaign ended up getting thrown away. But once the co-op stuff had come together and the missions were starting to get fleshed out better, I think we kind of realized co-op in a very bespoke roller coaster ride, Michael Bay AAA blockbuster campaign kind of doesn't work. It's like, it's very hard to custom tailor an exciting cinematic roller coaster ride experience for 4 players, and so that was something that we learned a little bit later in the development process, which ultimately led to the reason that zombies existed, was the need to have a smaller, replayable co-op mode that you could play with your friends. That actually was at the heart of what co-op gameplay was about.
Wow. And so zombie
I'm not
mode
answering
wasn't
your questions at all. I'm just kind of talking at this point.
This is,
sorry.
I'm glad you brought up zombie mode. I was when I was in college, I played zombie mode with my soccer teammates over and over again, seeing how far we could progress through the levels. How many? I'm trying to remember the name of the guns. There's like the Wunderwaffe.
Yep. Wunderwaffe. I mean, the ray gun's the one that has just stayed. That was one of those guns that was, it was kind of kitschy retro 50s style sci-fi, but very much fit the era. And there was not really a strong narrative thread or universe around zombies when it first came out. That was the thing that sort of came together with, the mode itself had only existed because individuals from every department just put in extra work to make it happen. And so all of those sort of individual contributions that came together helped to shape what the identity of zombies was. And then as time went by, as more content was released, you saw this, the community reactions to all of those little pieces, and they started forming their own narratives, their own hypotheses. And there was a very conspiratorial kind of thread to all of the community, talk about it. And which we loved. I mean, like as developers are, especially a few members of our team were really, really, really into that kind of MK Ultra sort of vibe stuff, and seeing where the community was going with it, and then started playing with the community and adding, like it was this feedback loop. They would come up with conspiracy theories. We'd say, well, that looks like a fun one to play with. So we'd feed into that conspiracy theory for the next one, and it kind of went on like that through the 4 DLC releases of World at War. And until you got to Doris the End, where I think a lot of fans, really think about that as a big change, like a big point for the solidification of that narrative universe.
I'm curious about the like transition. Do you think that the reason why you guys came up with zombie mode was because you had worked on a game that was sort of similar, or are they completely detached and like there wasn't like we kind of already designed this before?
It was completely detached. I know it seems very much like, that was a good synthesis of an earlier game that Treyarch was working on, but the developers. Most of the developers who were building zombies had actually come from Gray Matter. Not all, but most. So I think that thread of what Dead Rush had been, there were little bits that came into it because some of the engineers had worked on Dead Rush on the team. But for the most part, it was really, I think, the origin. I mean, it's been talked about before, but the origin of the actual zombie part of it, inspiration had come out of a mocap session where they were doing motion capture for kind of walking wounded soldiers that just come out, or shell shocked. They'd just come out of an explosion. And so as they were hobbling around, they looked like zombies. The character models were bloody and dirty, and they were hobbling like zombies. And that kind of, I think, started the foundation of that idea.
It's fascinating because I think the reason why it resonated with me so much was because I had played Return to Castle Wolfenstein, and so like the idea of Nazi zombies was like already like there, and it was like a opportunity to like re-engage with that concept.
And that Gray Matter team had worked on Return to Castle Wolfenstein as well.
Oh, well, there you go. I knew there was a connection here.
Yeah.
Cool. So I think let's keep going. Let's talk about Black Ops, because that obviously has turned into that sort of came off of World at War. I'm curious, like, what were it was following Modern Warfare, which had been this, huge moment. I played that game for hundreds of hours. And so you talked about how like you guys were looking at Infinity Ward, and it almost felt like at that point it was like, oh, who's gonna like make the better game? Black Ops seemed to like go in a different direction, carve out its own identity, and that's sort of gone on to be its own sub franchise. I'm curious to understand, like, what was that process like? How did Black Ops become such a distinct game from Modern Warfare?
I think any group of developers is going to bring their own sensibilities to the table, especially in a younger team like we were at the time, because you're not experienced enough to get kind of infused with some of the like business knowledge, I guess, and thinking about it as a franchise. You were thinking about it as your game. And I think that kind of rawness and the magic that comes out of it, I think, is what helps to shape that identity. World at War, like I said, was the beginning of our expression of our identity and our tastes and our kind of fictional preferences. And you started to see the beginning, the what we called mindfuckery later. But mindfuckery became the linchpin of the whole Black Ops ethos. And the introduction of Reznov in World at War was such an iconic character. I actually did a little talk about this at USC not too long ago, but because it's such an interesting, like the whole story around Reznov is really cool. But
I'm down to take a diversion. Let's do it.
Oh man, it's a long one, but it was Gary Oldman was the voice actor for Reznov, but the very introduction of him in World at War was just such a memorable moment in that game, because you wake up at the beginning of the mission, you don't know what's going on. It's sort of like you're coming in and out of consciousness. There's these black crows and dead bodies around you, and you see German soldiers walking by. You're inside this fountain, and you start crawling. Once the player gets control, you start crawling. And as you're crawling, you see the kind of German soldiers walking past, and one of the dead bodies just turns to look at you and gives you a whisper, but he whispers with his missing finger, which that's just like, to me, I remember like the putting together of that moment was just such an iconic thing. And it still gives me chills just thinking about it. But thinking about like the history of him after that, and then that was the introduction. We had no idea at the time what he was going to turn into. And then you learn that the missing finger was because he's a sharpshooter, he's a sniper, but he had his finger shot off. And so that's why he's giving you now the sniper rifle. And so then you have to take out all of these guards with the sniper rifle. And that was the setup for the sniper level. And it was just, I don't know, like it was just such a cool way to introduce that character. And he became so popular, like everyone loved him on the team. And of course we had to bring Gary Oldman back. So it was almost like Reznov, the character had to, be the reason that Black Ops existed, and so you saw Black Ops carrying the same themes forward, the dark themes, the mindfuckery, some of the MK Ultra stuff that crept into these dark CIA experiments on human psychology. And it was just a lot of fun material to play with. And on that project, I was focused a lot more on multiplayer than campaign at the time. I had, I had produced a handful of the campaign missions in World at War, but I really wanted to do multiplayer, first and foremost. So Black Ops was the first one. Was really the first time that multiplayer team as a core came together to work as one unit, where everyone had, was sort of, on the same team working towards the same mission. From a multiplayer perspective, we had a different philosophy, I think, than the Infinity Ward team did. The Modern Warfare game was very, very lethal. You could sneeze at a player and they're going to die. And so it really was a game of who sees the other player first. Mm-hmm. We wanted to have, not to say that like we were influenced by Halo or anything, but there were some games that had higher time to kill, and there's a certain thing that happens, there's a dance that happens in those combat encounters where you get an extra chance to break away and have a longer engagement. And we felt like those longer engagements and that second chance of being able to break away and circle back around and outflank the other guy, or outsmart the other guy, was fun. And that would be a more, that was just a more interesting and exciting way to play the game. And so that was where Black Ops 1 departed a little bit from Modern Warfare. We had a higher time to kill. It was a bit chunkier combat.
Yeah.
But
definitely, I used I remember the thing that I remember about Black Ops is just using a silent shotgun and just sprinting around and getting into really close combat because for that reason, because you could survive long enough to get close enough to use the shotgun.
Yeah.
It was unique from in that sense from Modern Warfare, where it was like, yeah, you just use the heartbeat sensor and yeah,
Yeah.
that's cool. I'm curious about during that time period, were there any design or technology trends that were enabling these games to come through? Like, were you guys seeing technology that was not around previously that you were then introducing into the games?
That's probably another one of those areas where we, just not knowing what we don't know led us to making very kind of ambitious decisions about
Mm-hmm.
things. We had introduced the emblem editor. We'd introduced the theater mode. We were very into our team, and the DNA of our team was very much, massively into social systems
Mm-hmm.
um, and building a tighter social weave around the game, and that drove us to build a lot of these kind of, the theater system, for example, didn't exist in the game. The technology to do it was kind of there, but in terms
Remind
of
me what the theater system was.
so theater was the fact every single game was recorded from a data point of view. So it's not video recording; it's recording the data, the positioning, and location of all the entities in the world at any point in time. And so it would record that as a data chunk. It would then get stored. You could stream it back down to your system to watch replays.
Oh wow.
So you could have an entire match, would be replayable. We put controls for fast forward, rewind, free camera controls. The features that were around that were really robust over time. I mean, over the next 3 games, we added the ability to attach cameras to objects. So, like if you had an amazing combat axe kill, you could attach the camera to the combat axe. It would follow it to the kill. So people could make really cool videos using the theater.
Wow.
And that was totally outside of core gameplay. I mean, there was very little reason, I guess, for us logically to do it because it wasn't core to the game.
Well, I guess there
But
was, YouTube was coming up around that time,
yeah,
right? So
that's true. Yeah. And then with Black Ops 2, we integrated Twitch streaming functionality and YouTube streaming functionality directly into the game. Because at that time, Twitch was not big yet. So we were able to actually get the Twitch team to very heavily focus on feature development just to make our game stream their service directly out of it, or directly out from our game into their service, I should say. And that they weren't it wasn't a really big platform at the time. I think they just set up Twitch outside of Justin TV, very, recently. And but because they were a small team, it was also a startup and also very eager to make a name for themselves. They bent over backwards to help, get their streaming service connected to Black Ops 2. So that was another one of those examples of just pure social features, totally outside the game, not core to the game, but it was things that we were passionate about and trying to be kind of cutting edge technology wise. I mean, there's a million pieces of tech I could go into, but those are just some of the ones that just top of mind.
got it. On the design side, so I've noticed that the maps have gotten smaller over time. I remember with Black Ops, they were still pretty expansive in terms of all of the.
We used to call Turbine was Old Man Turbine. That was what we called it in house because it was such a large map that it took forever to compile and build for. So anytime we were trying to ship the game in Black Ops and we're in 2:00 in the morning trying to get the game out the door to first party submission. And it's there's a bug in Turbine. It was oh my God, you had to wait because then you had to wait for that entire map to build before you could get the next game build out. That was such a nightmare. But yes, they were much larger earlier on. We took a very data driven approach to, kind of optimize. I think there are, if you follow data just 100% purely, it's always going to over-index on just the single thing that people always want. And that can be self-defeating, because then people will get bored. It'll feel grindy. They're not getting enough variety to their experience. So we didn't always just, everybody would want Nuketown or Shipment, or Rust like that. They would want, Nuketown. It's the most popular map of all time in the franchise. And it is for good reason. It's just constant action. There's never a moment of downtime, really. But
why do you think it's so why do you think that's so hard to replicate? Because you wouldn't think of Nuketown as like that very complex map to design, and yet at least in my experience playing it over the last 6 months, there really isn't a map that sort of is as compelling as that.
Nuketown has its own experience or its own story to tell. That was another part of that talk that I gave at USC, but it actually, there was a design Bible for how to build really good Call of Duty levels, and you could go through and it's well documented over 60 pages or something, all the different rules, and those got refined over the years, of course, through iteration. But if you go and you actually looked at the rules of level design for COD at the time, and you look at Nuketown, you could check all the boxes. And that was the goal in that map in the first place, was we wanted to have a very small map that was like Shipment, but more structured. So we wanted to have a Shipment experience with a more viable, kind of 3-lane, checks all the boxes of the gameplay rules kind of map. And that was what, that was the slug in our schedule that Nuketown filled. And so, so every, it was the thing that was difficult with that map, because it was so small. And we did, different art styles of it over every game release. One of the biggest challenges is always line of sight, because it was so tightly constructed so that every line of sight was controlled. If you change the geo even a little bit, you would open something up that was unintended, So that was always a big challenge with that map, and reimagining it over the years was always making sure that those lines of sight were still covered. But every little detail and nuance conforms to the rules of the rule book of what makes great COD map design.
Got it. Which is the counterpoint to what you were saying just before we launch into this, which is you can't just follow what the data says, directly.
Yeah.
I'm curious. All right. So what are some maps, or what are some examples of things that emerged that weren't data driven, or maybe broke some rules that prove the rule?
Oh man, rule breakers. We had a lot of rule breaker maps. I would say that there was never a map where you could break, too many rules at once. A lot of times what we would do is say, hey, what makes this map interesting is we'll break one rule. We'll do something that we don't normally do or doesn't fit within the construct of the game. I think about some of the map interactive objects that we would put in, radiation from Black Ops 1. You had the big bay doors that could open and close. You had the conveyor belt that players could walk up onto. A lot of kind of little things like that really were not part of core gameplay, but just made the map spicy. Summit had the hanging gondola that you could jump in. Wasn't super useful, but it was kind of fun and cool when you got a kill from it.
Yeah.
Felt pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool. So I'm curious about the competitive environment. So, Battlefield went in a completely opposite direction of going from small scale to massive scale. How did you guys approach your competitors over the years? Did you look at what Halo was doing and what Battlefield was doing? Or were you really just focused on your and building the best possible version of your game?
We play, we were gamers at heart, so we all play games. So we all look at the other games that are coming out, especially shooters. But I don't remember ever a time really looking at what they were doing and being like, oh my God, we have to go compete at that level. Like we just always had our thing, and I feel like the battle between COD and Battlefield was really more of a media manufactured battle, because I don't ever feel like internally that was a thing that we worried about. They were just such different games. They were both first person shooters. They both had guns. They both had military themes, and that was about where it ended. Beyond that, you had very large scale vehicular combat with heavy on destruction versus very small scale kind of arcadey combat, which was low time to kill. Very different game experiences. So it was not something that we really worried about. I think the only time we ever felt, there was one Halo launch that happened the week before one of our game launches. I want to say it was Black Ops 3, which definitely did soften the week 1 launch, but it picked up and then some in week 2. So it was like, it never really was a thing.
Got it. What do you think? I'm curious what your perspective is on why Call of Duty sort of took the lead spot, and why Halo and Battlefield haven't been able to keep up. Are there any insights that you can share on what made Call of Duty so much more successful?
I mean, I would probably boil it down to sticking to your knitting. Like, instead of trying to chase other people, once you start trying to chase competitors, then you've already kind of lost the race. I think with Call of Duty, it was a very, like I said, we were never trying to copy what the other shooters were doing. We were trying to do our own thing. In fact, we would be more interested in what other non-shooter genre games were doing in terms of systems and mechanics and ideas. And I think that once you started to see the other franchises, I guess, I mean, I don't want to, I wasn't there working on them, so I can't tell you, but when you started to see them drift a little more towards trying to compete against COD or emulate some of the Call of Duty feel or vibe or style, I think that actually weakened their efforts. But they've always been great games. I mean, I was a huge Halo, before I got into the games industry, I was connecting LANs for Halo 1 and using a tunneling app just so I could play online, because they didn't have native online support. So to play multiplayer online, you had to use these basically hacked Xbox consoles and a tunneling app on your PC.
Yeah. So I guess so. Halo was maybe was in the top spot like earlier on, and then Call of Duty just has been so consistently successful year over year. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on like what's enabled Call of Duty to have that long-term franchise retention. Like, why do players come back every single year to play the next Call of Duty?
So there's a couple things. One of the things that I would always say about Call of Duty is it's a greatest hits franchise. It was not the one blazing trails on new features and mechanics necessarily. A lot of them would be, ideas that were maybe smaller ideas that were done in independent games or smaller games that seemed really cool, and that would build a following. I mean, you look at game modes like Prop Hunt, that would get adopted in its own sort of Call of Duty twist into the game. And over the years, of course, what that means is now you have something for everybody. You've got large scale battle royale, you have extraction shooter, you have 2v2 small scale PvP action, you've got zombies, you've got wacky game modes like Prop Hunt, and everything in between. So it's just a part of it's just like always kind of, we always were driven by this idea of surprising and delighting the fans and bringing new experiences so that there's different variety that people can enjoy and attract new audiences. That was one thing. I mean, like the core, though, of course, just the feel of it was, nobody could replicate the feel, the snappiness, the fast pace, the immediate reaction. I mean, we really leaned into the moment to moment and making sure that player feedback systems were super dialed in.
Yeah.
I still
I
to
mean,
this day, like as an advisor to other companies, I'm like player feedback systems. Number one, like get that right. You've got to do everything, go the extra mile to give every little piece of feedback to players in every step of the way.
so that when you refer to player feedback, those are like the sort of the pop-ups that are
Sounds,
reinforcing
animations,
Yeah.
UI, controller rumble, just every little piece of sensory input that you can give back to players for doing things in the world or interacting with the world.
Yeah. I distinctly remember, I think it was Modern Warfare 2 when like it was just like this, there was just like a never-ending roll of feedback of like, you did this, you did that, you did this, you did that. And it's like, okay, cool.
It's almost comical at some point.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So I want to take some time to sort of like, we've been talking about the history, but I'm curious about personal reflections on Call of Duty and your legacy there. Like what stands out to you as your proudest accomplishments of your time over the 18 years that you were at Treyarch?
I mean, to be honest, my proudest accomplishment is when we looked at just our internal team member retention numbers and saw that 50% of our studio had been there for 10 years or more.
Wow.
So that above anything else that we did, I think the fact that we had a really great culture that kept people together and motivated them to stick with it game after game after game. We were always, a part of it was the culture of the studio. It was the fact that we did feel like underdogs, so we always were trying to prove ourselves. That can bring people together. The fact that we, we're trying to constantly innovate and do different things in the franchise, even though conventional wisdom would be to just keep iterating and adding more of what you're already doing well. So we were big risk takers. The fact that we had good workflows, I think, the way that people worked together was really productive. Constant play testing and feedback sessions. We would, I think at one point we had like 3 different play tests with different groups happening every day of the week. It's just, that was just kind of ingrained in the culture. Is you're constantly playing your game. You're constantly talking about your game. You're constantly defining what's the next thing you need to do to make it better.
That's amazing. And it's really interesting to hear that because it's in stark contrast to like what I think a lot of people hear about, Activision Blizzard and the culture there. Like, it seems like you guys had carved out a distinct culture within the broader parent company.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, the original kind of the whole business model around Activision from the early days was this independent studio model. And that, I think with every large company that matures over the years, that it may not be able to be sustainable for forever, but that is definitely what built, I think, the success there. And so each studio did have a lot of flexibility, freedom, autonomy to carve their own path and define their own culture, build games the way that it made the most sense for their team to build them. And I think, a lot of that kind of that autonomy is what allowed it to be a unique place, a unique culture.
Yeah. I mean, it's wild to just think about, like, you had been there for 18 years. Half the team had been there for more than 10 years. Like, you guys must have all just been like a family. I mean, you're not supposed to say that your coworkers are family members, but I feel like if it applies to anything, it would be like that team, right?
Very much so. I'm not going to, sugarcoat it. It was hard. There were weeks that I remember, for months on end, I'd be putting in 100 hours plus a week. I think the longest time I spent in the office without going home was that I was into the 4th day.
Oh my God.
So it's not like, so there's plenty of pain points, but it was something that we at least always were trying to improve, and it did improve over the years from game to game. Every game, I think, got better. And, I know, in the last couple of projects I worked on, it felt like it was despite the fact that it was also like, I think the standards were a lot higher. If you looked at it purely relative to previous projects, it was heads and shoulders above where we had been in terms of like, crunch culture and things like that.
What enables that? Because presumably the reason why crunch culture exists is because you're delivering a product in a very specific time period, and if you could do it more efficiently, everyone would love to do it. So how are you guys able to sort of adapt?
It starts at the top. I mean, that's the number one thing. You do have to have it is a leadership challenge, and a lot of that it's about development discipline. You need to be willing to cut features constantly, which I think is hard for a lot of teams. But if you can constantly cut based on an ongoing assessment of scope, some teams, I've heard a lot of disparaging of like production when it comes to creative game development teams, but I was a huge supporter of production. I think that production was the glue that made everything work just so much more efficiently, and allowed developers to actually be able to add more polish to their features, because a lot of that kind of like overhead and otherwise challenging interactions with other team members would be kind of bogging them down. But we had a really just world-class production team, and always keeping a finger on the pulse of development and understanding where we were, how much would it cost us to do whatever XYZ thing was. And they weren't making the decision; they were just advising the leadership. But it's that awareness of what state are we in at any moment in time, and are we right sizing our development to make sure that we're not going to get underwater.
Are there any feedback loops in order to like cut features? Like you can quickly test something and see if it's going to be valuable to players?
If it's not fun within the first 2 to 3 iterations, then it's going to be very hard to make it fun.
Got it. So, and is that internal testing or?
Yeah, just with the team.
Got it. Cool. Okay, so I want to sort of transition into forward looking a bit. Well, and I want to also hear more about what you're working on today. But before we get into that, one last question just on the C.O.D franchise. When you look at, the next 10 years, are there any sort of key challenges you see for the franchise, or do you think that, this franchise is just here forever?
So I'm speaking purely as an outside observer at this point. I think that it's going to be important for the franchise to maintain a certain amount of nimbleness, because there's a lot of disruption happening right now. The industry is, across the industry, it's we are in the midst of a disruptive moment. And there's a lot of factors going into that, from AI to, lack of funding to publishers not knowing how to, kind of navigate the current market, to otherwise kind of random indie hits becoming the big games of the year. I just think that there's a lot of uncertainty that's happening right now, and I think it's always going to be harder for incumbent franchises that are large and kind of like just development heavy to be able to navigate change in that way. So I think that's the big thing, is just being able to be aware of what's happening around and be able to constantly be able to adapt. Still nobody, you still see a lot of games coming out where people will try them and they go back to C.O.D. C.O.D is still a big staple for most players that are, into that genre.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so sort of in a similar vein. So now you're a venture capitalist. What are the things that you're most excited about in the video game industry?
Well, in a lot of ways, I've gone 180 degrees from where I was. I was buried deep into development in a very insular bubble for many, many years, and then on the outside, it's the complete, it's just a different world. But I've been having so much fun because it is so different. 20 years doing one thing a certain way, and then now the last 3 years doing a completely different thing has been really rewarding for me. I love working with other developers, especially startups, because it reminds me of where what I went through in the early days of my career with those early teams. And it's having that 23 years now of hindsight to be able to help other people do things better is very satisfying to me.
We have a lot of entrepreneurs who listen to the podcast, so I'm just kind of curious to know what are some of those pitfalls that you're helping entrepreneurs navigate, or what are some of the common pitfalls you see?
One of the things is that people, especially if they've come out of AAA or come out of large established operations, don't realize, even if they get a lot of funding, how hard it is to go from 0 to 1. Mm-hmm. And everybody who goes into that space needs to think of it as like they don't have any money. They're scrappy. They're punching above their weight. They are doing everything that they can to outperform. Because that's what you have to do. So that's one thing, is just, even if you have a decent amount of funding, like, don't act like you have a decent amount of funding. Development is unpredictable. There's always going to be something that comes up that derails your plan. Every single one. I've never been on a project that didn't have a derailing moment, or multiple. So I think, like, being prepared for the storms is an important part. Understanding that there are smarter ways to do stuff. I think, and I've kind of, I've had this conversation recently with some of my friends and peers. If you are a, very senior veteran at a development studio that's been managing people for a long time, if you haven't gotten your hands dirty, it's going to be very, very hard for you to adapt to startup life. The most experienced people in the industry who are also successful as startups are able to get in and still work with their hands, still do stuff, still build things. Because you do have to wear a lot of hats as an entrepreneur, as a startup. Think about, like, you're probably 3 games away from being at a little bit more settled place that's closer to what you came from. And that's kind of how you have to set your mind to it.
What do you mean by you're 3 games away?
So, your first game is going to be, even though you've learned a lot in your past life or whatever your career has been, it's going to be very different, and it's going to be a lot of headache. You're setting up your tech base, you're setting up your processes and pipelines. You may have new tools that you're using that didn't exist before. You've got maybe different people in the mix. There's less people. You probably don't have all of the advanced, like, build systems that help you optimize your build processes and QA processes and all the things that can basically drive efficient game development. And so you have to rebuild all that stuff. And it's never going to happen in one game. It's going to be like, that's like, I generally think 3 games is about the time it takes to get to a much more stable place where your systems are refined, your people are much more comfortable working together, and you're just kind of firing on all cylinders.
It's interesting. Yeah, I'm coming from the publishing angle, and I was like, 3 games, like, that's too many games.
Yeah,
we need it now.
I know that, but it and I think it's important for publishers to understand that it's a messy business.
I'm curious your perspective on just the difference between venture capital funding and publisher funding. Like, do you think there's merits to both, or what do you think the funding model for the future is?
Everyone's trying to figure it out right now. Everyone's going to have hot takes about this. I don't want to give you my hot take per se, but I can talk about kind of what the landscape looks like. Cool. Basically it breaks down into 2 categories. You have equity and you have debt. That's kind of how those are the 2 ways that you can finance any of these ventures. VC is always historically been focused on equity, which means that you're buying stakes in a company early on, which then gives them money to fund their development, to bring their product to market, blah, blah, blah. You hope that down the line there's going to be an acquisition or an IPO, some kind of exit event. That's the only way that VC exists. That's the only thing that makes sense for equity at all. So I think for that model to actually work better in our industry, we need more M&A activity. So we need the industry itself needs to mature where there's enough big players out there that are competing at the highest levels and are opportunistically going out and buying teams that are going to complement their brand or product lineup or skill set or technology. And I feel like at the moment, and I'm not tapped into every single like M&A activity in the industry like some of the later stage folks are, but there are, from my perspective, there's not enough M&A to sustain the influx of venture capital that's come into the games in the last, call it 8 years. Maybe it will get there eventually. I think we're definitely not in a place for it right now, but I'm hoping in the next few years you'll start to see it spin up again. So that's the kind of like the venture capital equity side. Then on the debt side, you have various models. You've got publishers will do dev financing, which is basically just like a rev share deal. That effectively it's a loan. It's like, here's a bunch of money. We're going to take it back first out of your first sales until we get to a recoup point, and then you're going to have some sort of trailing percentage beyond that of how much revenue share you get. That model is the longest and most standard in our industry, right? And I think that in the past, though, it's been not very developer friendly, which is why you see so many developers trying to spin out and do their own things. And so the marketplace needs to be more competitive. I think there needs to be more publishers. You are seeing a little bit of this happening right now, where there's sort of micro publishers coming out. There's different models of publishers coming out. There's shadow publishing, like what Midwest's Games has been doing and talking about.
I don't know shadow publishing. What is that?
Well, it's sort of like publishing for hire. It's not about rev share. It's about services.
Okay,
if that makes sense.
Okay.
And so I think that model needs to evolve, but it's not going to evolve from some grand person saying this thing. It's going to evolve because there's competition in the marketplace. And so I do hope that there's more publishers that can start up, that more publishers can be effective at different scales, and they can like I love seeing when small publishers can have a big outsized hit. I mean, you look at kind of like Black Myth this last year, and PM Games is hot right now, right? Like growing. Just talked to them the other day, and it was very cool to kind of like hear their journey and how they've gotten to where they are. And so I think that you need to have a much more competitive publishing ecosystem for all of that to kind of be a healthier industry. I think what you're seeing between those two models is, and it will also, there's other things like venture debt and other kind of financing models that are like credit or whatever, but those are basically the two. You're seeing a little bit of experimentation on both sides. So publishers are making more strategic investments, meaning like they're buying an earlier equity stake with the as a part of that deal, they will take first right of refusal for publishing. So they kind of that's sort of a way for them to protect the long tail upside while also making sure that they're bringing in capital return in the short term. And then you see some VCs that have pivoted to dev financing or more like a publishing model. And I think really what the fundamentals are is that to get investment in games and game studios, you have to return capital. That's basically, that's like the bottom line. And are you returning enough capital at a good enough pace to where people are interested? You're bringing in a lot of outside investors, or the capital's flowing. There's more and more investment. And so, we need to find a model as an industry where we're returning value to investors on a much more regular basis. there's a number of ways to do that. You could start to do blended deals, like I mentioned, where a publisher might make a strategic equity investment and then they do a publishing deal for rev share. VCs can do that as well. They can blend, if they set up a model where that's kind of that blended model is how they operate. That would, I think, could return a lot more value to investors. I think companies need to issue dividends more, which I don't. I haven't talked to many folks that do that, but maybe it's out there. So I think long term, we're going to all have to kind of evolve a little bit. I don't think that pure venture capital in the traditional sense works very well in games, at least not right now, because there's not enough M&A to justify all of these venture bets.
Well, now I just want to know what your hot take is, but I won't force you to tell us. What's the best way for folks to follow you and follow your journey from here, Dan?
I don't do a lot of social media, honestly, but LinkedIn is where I probably do most communicating with the industry at large.
Awesome.
But I'm not a frequent poster, so it just heads up.
Don't be offended if it takes a while to get back to you.
That's right. Oh my God, it's my inbox. My messages are a nightmare. It's like 20 a day. I just can't keep up.
Well, it's been a privilege to have you on the podcast. I'm glad you responded to my email to be on this. And
thank you. Yeah,
thanks so much thanks for teaching us all about Call of Duty today.
Yeah, I just my goal and what I enjoy doing at this point in my career is helping other people, and that's it. So, I just I love to be able to share whatever stories I can that are going to help other people be more successful in their careers.
Awesome. So if you're listening, make sure to share with as many people as possible so they can get all of the juicy insights that Dan shared with us today.
Thanks.
If you enjoyed today's episode, whether on YouTube or your favorite podcast app, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, or give a 5-star review. And if you want to reach out or provide feedback, shoot us a note at podcast@naavik.co or find us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Plus, if you want to learn more about what Naavik has to offer, make sure to check out our website, www.naavik.co. There, you can sign up for the #1 games industry newsletter, Naavik Digest, or contact us to learn about our wide-ranging consulting and advisory services. Again, that is www.naavik.co. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.